Hello, so the webinar, welcome to the webinar series of the ESCP Geopolitical Institutes. Maybe we are going to wait another minute to let the participant get in the webinar and not miss our very interesting talk of today. So another minute maybe, or half a minute, and then we'll start. All right, so I guess, that's less than half a minute, but I think we should start right now as all our invitee speakers are here. Today, we will address a very important and contemporary topic, political risk. While the concept is not new, challenging to the world posed by pandemic, nationalism, technological transformation, climate change, or the threat of war, call for a thoughtful reflection on the topic. In this era of polycrisis, businesses and other stakeholders need to understand and manage political risk. This will be the focus of this webinar, the title of which being Analyzing Political Risk for Business in an Uncertain Geopolitical Landscape. In order to discuss this topic, we are very pleased to welcome 3 of the 4 editors of the first Routledge Handbook of Political Risk. With them, we will explore both the concept and practice of political risk. So we have with us today Cecilia Sottilotta, Professor of Political Science at the University for Foreigners of Perugia, Julian Campisi, Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and Meissner, Doctor of Political Science, academic at the University of Applied Science, BFY Vienna, but also a managing partner at PRISK, where he does business consulting and risk analysis and management. The 3 of them, with their colleagues Johannes Leitner, have put together a series of papers and offer pioneer analysis of political risk. As per our panel today, the handbook puts forward the vision and analysis of academics and business professionals from multiple continents and industries. It proposes an excellent guide for businesses in situation of political risk and uncertainty. Each of our experts will address a specific dimension of the debate. We will then, as usual, open the floor for discussion and question. So we'll start first with Cecilia, who will explain the purpose of the handbook and the evolution and definition of political risk. Then we'll follow with Julian, who will discuss political risk and how it can be managed and covered by business actors. And then we'll finish by Hannes, who will show how consulting firm can help business actors analyze and respond to political risk. And then, of course, your question. The debate will be moderated by my colleague, Maxime Lefebvre, co-director of the ESCP Geopolitical Institutes and contributor to the Routledge Handbook of Political Risk, to which he might show us like the cover of the book, such that you see what we are talking about today. Okay, you will get a better view maybe in the replay. So we'll start now. Please do not hesitate to ask your question in the Q&A tag below. Thank you very much. And Cecilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much. First of all, I would really like to thank Maxime, Vanessa, Aurélie, and a fantastic team at the ESCP for inviting us. It's really a great opportunity. We just came out with this Routledge Handbook of Political Risk, and we're really excited to talk about it. So thank you very much for the opportunity. So just to tell you a little bit about this book, we're all like all of the editors, so Julian, Hannes, Johannes, and myself, we have been working on political risk in various capacities for many years. So we are academics with also some business consulting experience. And we've always been interested in how businesses see and interact with politics. Now, things in the past few years have obviously become more uncertain, more complicated, right? So with this handbook, and maybe Maxime will also chip in later with some ideas, we try to combine this sort of academic vision, like analysis, and how practitioners make use of all this knowledge. right? And in this sense, I jump right on the concept of political risk, because political risk analysis, in its classic definition, is actually all about this interplay between the international businesses and their political environments, right? So this is a really complex field. It can be approached starting from very different angles and disciplines. So our idea with this handbook was actually to somehow provide not unity in a sense, because it's a very, as if you will go through the book, it's very diverse in terms of contributors, so regions covered, topics covered, but give some kind of sense of a leading thread. What are the key themes in that? What are the key issues that businesses have to face in terms of political risk today, but also how do they do that, right? And then Hannes will certainly tell us more later. So as Vanessa was saying a few minutes ago, obviously recent developments, so pandemic, the newly waged wars, the climate change really challenge us to think hard about political risk. What is its meaning, right? And I would start by saying that I mean, technically in the past, in the sort of neoliberal, in the golden age of neoliberalism, if we want to call it like that, in the global, the golden age of globalization, probably one of the key sources of political risk for businesses in general was actually the intervention of the government in the economy. So if we think about these big issues, now the big picture, markets versus government, right, versus state, if you will, political risk may actually come from the intervention of the state in the market. So businesses, we're obviously talking about especially Western businesses, were chiefly worried about, I don't know, military coups or expropriation, nationalization of entire industries sometimes. Now, in the past few years, we're really entering this era of polycrisis. We use this term to define this situation where we have multiple interconnected global crises. So, okay, we have the pandemic, but then also the financial consequences of the pandemic. And then, Ukraine gets invaded by Russia. And then, so it's really a series of crises that intertwine and sort of feed into each other. And now the question is that perhaps in this is one of the ideas that we put out there, in the theoretical chapter of this handbook, is that perhaps nowadays it is too little state that may create problems. So it's not just state intervention in the markets, but it's also the lack of intervention that may generate issues. And this is the case, especially in this asymmetric world. And I'm sure that here, yes, Maxime will have something to say. In this asymmetric world where we have actors that do not play by the rules of the liberal, globalized economy, I mean, if we have these actors, like we have other actors like that play by the book, like this interplay becomes really dangerous for those that leave everything to the markets, so to speak, right? So we are now, and this is something unprecedented and to some extent surprising if we look at today's situation with the same eyes that we may have 10 years ago. We have now the European Union now discussing industrial policy. No, so in the past it used to be almost a bad word. Now we are entering a stage in which it's not anymore like about diffused and diversified sort of production chains, but it's actually about the resilience of economies. It's not about just on time anymore. It's about just in case. Now, if we think about in terms of production, in terms of operations of entire industries. So this is like one of the points that we need to take into account. Like this is one of the big shifts that we kind of observed, and many of the contributions in our handbook really deal with these issues. Another thing that I would like to sort of address, because I think it's kind of relevant to the discussion, and certainly relevant to the handbook contents. There's always been in the literature about political risk a dichotomy between macro political risk and micro political risk. So traditionally, macro political risk is about the big picture, again, like big global issues. Looking at countries as units of analysis. So say, okay, what's the situation in terms of political risk in Italy today? Or what's the situation in the US? Or what's the situation in China? And this also is due to the fact that there's a big tradition of political risk analysis being conducted by area scholars, for instance, right? On the other hand, we used to have this idea of micro political risk. So political risk analysis that's focused on the individual firm or even on the individual project. Now, our contention in the handbook is that this dichotomy has become really nuanced. So much so that we wonder to what extent it is still useful. Why? Because not just because it is, even talking about micro and macro is an oversimplification, but because we saw that even the big global crisis par excellence, like take COVID-19 pandemic, it's a quintessential global crisis. Even that actually may affect individual sectors, industries, and even in the individual businesses within the same industry very differently, right? We saw during the pandemic how platforms like Zoom, for instance, which we are using right now, boomed. We saw other sectors in the industries which were obviously hit hard. So what we say is like we really have to be careful when we use this kind of distinctions, and we should especially pay a lot of attention to context, in a sense that context shapes both the exposure and the responses to political risk for firms, for businesses. So informal institutions and state capture also complicate formal risk assessment. So it's not just about, again, the study of institutions. We need to look at institutions. We need to look at, even the quantitative indicators that we may have that help us assess the quality of democracy, for instance, or governance. But we also need to be very much aware of how informality works, and especially in special contexts, which are maybe not mature democracies, but even democracies today are subject to erosion, right? So that's another theme that we kind of, I think, touched upon in the handbook. What used to be almost something like completely rid of political risks, like, okay, Western country, like the US, the place where everybody wants to invest because at the end of the day, politically, it's a safe, stable environment. But that's not the case anymore, right? We are now living at a time, very interesting times, as the Chinese would say, in which the president of the United States may start a trade war or a tariff war whose terms are very unclear. So this uncertainty is really everywhere. And which brings me perhaps to the last point I would like to make. We need to be aware of the fact that when we do political risk analysis, what we're trying to do is precisely to measure uncertainty. So to translate uncertainty, which is by definition unmeasurable, into something that we can measure, at least for a given from the standpoint of a given company. Okay, so I think this is perhaps the single most important thing. And again, I think that Hannes will tell us more about this. The job of the political risk industry and consultancies and companies in general is to sort of translate, so help us make sense of this very chaotic reality we live in and understand what the implications are for the individual business. And as I said before, the implications may be very different, even for businesses within the same industry. Okay, so we hope. I mean, the text, the handbook is a lengthy, heavy book, over 500 pages. It features different sections. We have a section on theoretical cross-cutting problems. We have a section with the country case studies, again, so focusing on special regions from the former post-Soviet space to Southern Africa, passing through Europe. We do have a section with case studies. So we also have, that's another thing, and maybe I would like to say that we do have also practitioners who contributed to this work. So yeah, I do hope we collect reactions, questions, and to have the chance to further discuss this with the panelists, with you, but also with the public.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Thank you for putting the context of this new geopolitical landscape, which influences the political risk, and for letting us know the handbook could not be more useful in present times. And as you say, it covers a lot of regions, a lot of aspects of this political risk analysis, because the objective is also to be able to measure political risk, but also to manage political risk. So I pass the floor to Julian about management, and in particular, the insurance of political risk. That's the title of your contribution to the handbook.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks to Maxime, Vanessa, and the team for setting this up, for keeping this conversation going. And of course, to Cecilia for introducing, the first sort of key points on political risk on our handbook, what it is, right? How we understand the concept, its context, and really how our handbook tries to approach political risk. And we've really tried to have that sort of focus on diverse approaches to political risk. And I will just add that maybe now that I move from greater context of the handbook into more management of political risk, and then Hannes further through expert input and consultant work, etc. We really try to ensure a broad, diverse set of viewpoints and focus on different aspects of risk, like Cecilia mentioned, whether that's places, spaces, different methods, different objectives on how to sort of manage and calculate and assess, et cetera, political risk. And so one of the sections of our handbook, it looks at political risk as a result of disruptive, global trends. And the chapters in that section, they interrogate things like climate change, AI, cybersecurity, the US-China conflict, and more. And so we think that, that speaks to the greater challenge of this sort of geopolitical uncertainty that we are all hearing about these days, and how difficult it has really become to forecast risk for international business, especially when it seems that things can and are changing so rapidly, almost on a daily basis, if we look at the US. For example, that global economic stability, which was, for decades anchored by the US economy and by free trade agreements and things like this, that is clearly no longer a certainty like it was before, and even at times seems out of reach in the medium term, is a case in point about this geopolitical uncertainty. Another section in our handbook is called New Trends in Political Risk Management. And here, the chapters look at different industries, different companies, and strategies that some of the contributors have encountered and have researched and practiced to mitigate risk, which, as we both mentioned, has become very difficult to do over the past, I would say, years to decade. And so with those two sections in mind, I'll try to make just a few broad-based, macro points over the next few minutes on, managing political risk with a focus on this geopolitical uncertainty, or this era or environment that we're living in now recently of geopolitical instability. So I think it's clear to everyone, or to most observers, that the global business environment is, increasingly shaped by this instability that we're talking about, whether that's, again, the US-China ongoing rivalry, hot wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, cyber threats, supply chain nationalism, tariff wars, and day-to-day, different levels and threats of tariffs and countermeasures, etc. Onshoring critical industries is another big thing we're hearing about, almost to the point of reshaping the global economic order. This seems like it's now within the realm of possible, whereas maybe even 5 or 10 years ago, we would have considered that to be, not such a possibility. So there are a lot of things out there to keep track of. And again, they are very difficult to predict. They're difficult to manage, especially regarding what outcomes they produce. And so, often categories and types of risks that companies, individuals, and firms often encounter, right? Whether that's sanctions and export controls. Recently we were hearing a lot about restrictions on tech exports, on critical minerals to China from China. We're hearing about jet engines being restricted, right? And then countermeasures in response to that. On the other hand, we have some of the more traditional political violence, civil unrest in cities, in shipping zones, right? What that means for the free transit of enterprise and things like this. We have ongoing, arbitrary regulatory action in different places with asset seizures. We have the ongoing risk that especially banks are coming or have been devoting a lot of attention to, especially on cyber attacks. Some of those have even moved into the political sphere, where we have, cyber political attacks trying to affect elections and things like this. So nation state, cyber intrusions into corporate infrastructure, but also public or government, right? Again, expropriation and things like this, confiscation, some of the traditional insurance-based risks around confiscation, expropriation, nationalization, and deprivation. This is an ongoing issue that companies have to face, of freezing of foreign-owned assets, especially during times of conflict or upheaval. And then, of course, we have this ongoing climate crisis and climate-related political instability and migratory pressures, where mass migration is moving northwards, or water, fire, drought, etc., is creating massive pressures where they hadn't necessarily been considered before, and what that means for stability in terms of a society, but also business. And on another note, and Cecilia briefly mentioned it in her closing remarks, for about a decade now, I've been arguing that political risk is no longer should be confined to frontier or emerging markets, which the discipline had for decades almost exclusively focused on. But in essence, I think we really ought to understand political risk as affecting not only ongoing emerging markets and frontier markets, but core sectors in, for example, G7 economies or the global north as well. And this may be in the form of, economic policy uncertainty, democratic backsliding, this sort of populist resurgence, which we thought went away, but never really went away, and now is back with a vengeance. Weakening of the rule of law, which, again, we're seeing in many countries of the global north. Distrust in government effectiveness, citizens being just unsatisfied with how governments are attacking different crises like housing costs or inflation, right, and more. And so most observers, I think, now know this. And you can also see large multinationals and consultancy houses creating their own sort of in-house boutique geopolitics teams within their own companies to respond to these trends. But I think one of the problems is many of these types of risks are harder to hedge. You can't just buy, PRI, political risk insurance coverage for something like I'm mentioning, as compared to, say, something more traditional like confiscation or expropriation coverage for your mining assets, in Bolivia or China or something like this, which is, which can be supported by insurance. So all this means that, business leaders must adopt really proactive and flexible strategies, I think, to protect your operations, to protect assets, and of course, reputations, right? So I think it's important to remember that this geopolitical uncertainty in this environment is not temporary, or at least in the short term. It's more likely a structural feature of the next, years to decade, and then it's hard to say when, right? And beyond, most likely. And so firms that treat political risk, strategically and as an ongoing consideration, rather than just a peripheral task that they have to think about once in a while, probably will be more resilient and competitive and better off in the long run. And so, on that note, some key broad-based questions or suggestions for firms, for CEOs regarding political risk that we can consider and ask are as follows, right? Does the firm have, or does it conduct, real-time geopolitical risk tracking, scenario response plans, right? Do they have teams and consultants or experts that they can trust to give some analysis on this very difficult environment to comprehend, right? And maybe more than just looking at annual risk indices. Are the foreign investments covered by political risk insurance or relevant bilateral treaties? Is the private PRI coverage limited to just a few perils, right? Can a firm leverage export credit facilities where possible? And also to consider, how trustworthy are bilateral treaties in an era of populism and political instability? This is something to consider. Is your supply chain exposed to high-risk jurisdictions or transit routes, or is it exposed to tariff threats and tariff war potential, right? How do you respond to that? Has a firm assessed, the cyber, political, and AI vulnerability issues in their infrastructure or in their service delivery, in their cloud storage? And if not, are there plans to do so? And finally, are there structured exit plans for key markets that are under rising tensions, both physical or financial, right? How do you plan for a strategy if tariffs are going to be enacted? And so naturally, this is not an exhaustive list, but I think it's a good place to start to keep this conversation going, to get us thinking about how we can actually adopt tools and strategies that include traditional vehicles like insurance, right, or export credit facilities, but more to manage and mitigate geopolitical risk, both in the medium term, but in the long term, which I think requires an ongoing consideration of these issues, right? To bring this into weekly or daily discussions in international business, boards, right? Geopolitical risks will be with us for some time, especially given the fact that in the contemporary era, these political risks are very complex. They're very interlinked and interdependent, and thus harder to predict. So I think Hannes, in a few moments, will shortly take you into some more detail on how experts and consultants can help business actors analyze and respond to political risks. And so I leave it to him to take us further down into the specifics. Thank you for your time. And yes, we look forward to questions and further discussion.
Thank you, Julian. And I remind you that you can ask questions in the chat. I have already some questions in the chat, but before we address them, I pass the floor to Hannes to give us the view of a very practical expert of political risk who deals with managing political risk as a consultant, but you also are a contributor in the handbook, especially regarding the post-Soviet space with your partner, Johannes Leitner.
Yeah, many thanks, Maxime and Vanessa and your team for organizing this event, and also thanks to Cecilia and Julian for explaining and giving a first introduction. Cecilia on the definition and how to analyze political risk, and Julian on how to manage political risk. So I would say I have the most difficult job now. I have to tell you how to make money with political risk by consulting. But in this regard, I would like, first of all, to come back to Cecilia's differentiation between macro-political risk and micro-political risk. So as you remember, the definition, macro-political risk factors that take place, or you can identify at the regional, global level, or country level. And micropolitical risk are factors that have an impact on a specific firm, a specific project, and as Cecilia has highlighted, so it's always, you know, that's it's difficult to draw this differentiation in practice. But at the very same time, I can tell you, when you do consulting, enterprises, what they need is you have to be very specific. You really have to tailor it down to a specific project, to the firm level. You really have to go into the business people's mind. So being too academic in this regard, that's not too good. They will always have the feeling you do not understand them, or you're talking on a different level, and you cannot connect to them. But from a practical point of view, what can you do? And I'd like to start with a very, very easy model of how to analyze political risk, of how to categorize political risk. I would say there are 3 levels. On the macro level, it's the geopolitical, global, and regional level. Here you can find and analyze political risk factors such as protectionism, sanctions, trade compliance regulations, conflicts, wars, terrorism. Then you have the country level, when you analyze country factors such as legal certainty, property rights, very important for enterprises. That's always an issue. Instability, political leadership, the attitude of the local government towards enterprises, foreign investors. Well, and that's also what we cover in our book. Then you go beneath the surface. It's a so-called the informal level, when you really go deep into the issues of state capture. State capture means that private elites misuse public office for their purposes. They by clientelism, they favor their own businesses of friends. They misuse the judiciary. They tailor the laws and regulations to benefit their needs. That's always a network of people, private elites, oligarchs, bureaucrats, ruling families. And that's something where we have to dive very deep into. So when you do consulting, what can you do? First of all, always go down to the micro level. That's important. Get into the head of the managers. They expect you getting into their head. Don't be too macro, always be micro, but of course you have to start from the macro level. And secondly, a very important question, how to collect data. At those levels, the geopolitical global level and the country level, I would say you can really work with open source intelligence, open source information to a high degree. Maybe except of the future of sanctions. We, for example, had a project recently, the future of US sanctions, where in case Trump wins, so he's won, and I can say what we found out by doing interviews within the OFAC and the people related to Trump and his potential administration back then. This gave us insights already, and that this is already human intelligence. That's something companies, in fact, pay for. When you look into the informal setting of countries, state capture, clientelism, systemic corruption, here you definitely need human intelligence information. So either you have very well-informed people, or you draw on cable reports, secret service information in the countries. That's very important to understand how the informal system works. So that's so much. That's what I want to say about methods to analyze political risk. But at the very same time, when you pick out the individual risk factors like protectionism, sanctions, conflicts and wars, you still have different methods of how to analyze political risk. For example, if you take the factor protectionism or tariffs, then it's always the question how to assess the geopolitical risk exposure in regards to protectionism, for example, but it could also be hybrid conflicts or trade compliance regulations. You always identify an individual geopolitical risk factor, and then you have to do the assessment, how the impact is on market access, on strategic planning, investment decisions, operative efficiency, supply chains, compliance, reputation. So that's a basic tool you can use in this regard. We, for example, had recently a project of how geopolitical bloc formatation, how it has an impact on market access. We worked with a company in the security critical infrastructure, in the field of security critical infrastructure, and they were wondering if they can sell the same equipment both in China and in the US. And in this regard, for example, we found out now they can still sell it in both countries, but in probably a couple of years, they would get blacklisted in the United States as the authorities there are preparing next steps of sanctions. And so in the end, we for example, in this case, we found a solution that they offer a different product for China than what they do in the US. So that's a very, very specific case. Another case, trade compliance has become a very important issue, trade compliance management. It's also a form of political risk management. And here, you know, there are standard methods an up-to-date trade compliance management system has to include its annual KYC checks, reports on an open source intelligent level. Companies need an annual risk mapping. They need a code of conduct. The staff has to be trained in terms of the code of conduct, the trade compliance policy. They need a correction plan in case trade compliance breaches have taken place. They need awareness raising meetings for the trading partner. So these are standard elements of a modern trade compliance management system, and that's also political risk management. Another area, scenario analysis, very important. Many companies right now, they're all preparing for going into Ukraine as soon as the war is over, as they expect. But as we can see, the end of the war and a European Ukraine, that's only one scenario. There are probably other more likely scenarios, like the long war scenario, or even the Ukraine lost scenario. So scenario analysis, and then at a first stage on the macro level, and then assess the impact on enterprises and business projects, and then tailor and develop resilience strategies, another political risk management strategy in this regard. Yeah, and finally, still very important, state capture coping strategies. You know, all those countries, Russia, Ukraine, Central Asian states, most emerging countries in the world, these are countries where formal institutions are not as strong as we expected from our perspective, or businesses expected, as private actors, private elites misuse that. Their power, favoring their own businesses, disfavoring independent actors. They're often corrupt, they misuse laws, regulations. And disregard by carrying out human intelligence strategies. You have to dive deep into, you really have to understand the context in which you want to do business. You have to understand who your partners are. And that has to take place with human intelligence methods. We recently did an OSINT KYC check for a client, and the open source intelligence KYC check was totally clean. And we also in a second step, because the partner, our client, did not feel very well had some suspicion. So we looked deep into that with a cable report, Human Intelligence, and we found out that they have a very bad track record as they are deliberately working for Russia to circumvent sanctions. So that's something you really have to look into. How are people connected? What are their hidden interests? And then you can apply coping strategies, cooperating with local partners, providing securities. You have to find the right partners, mobilizing support agents in the country, creating win-win constellations with the people and the local business partners and the people related to the elite. So we're not talking about corruption. Corruption is something you cannot carry out anymore, and it's really dangerous and risky. So but apart from that, there are enough of strategies, of how to do business in those countries. Stay below the radar of the ruling elite, mobilizing external agents. There are lots of strategies, and if you look into our book, you will also find cases from business cases. The authors, managers also wrote an article, a chapter for our book. Most of our chapters also include a section dealing with management strategies, political risk management strategies in regards to every risk category we look at. So every chapter, I think it's really worth looking into our book, and I think you will also find a lot of information of how to consult business. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannes. You show in your intervention that there is a kind of a broad spectrum between the political science, the macro approach of political risk, but the very practical, operational analysis and management. I have already in the chat a lot of questions. I can suggest to you that you can also read the questions if you want to answer them, because it's difficult to read all of them. But what I see from the questions, for example, there is a question of data. How you find the sources about political risk, because many sources, for example, in the case of the Taiwan crisis, are not public. So how do you have access to these sources? Can you cooperate possibly with military people, with state actors in order to get some intelligence, in order to manage political risk? What you say, Hannes, about, for example, the cooperation with human intelligence, local actors, it can be linked also with economic intelligence, which is something which is quite good covered in France, for example. This is an important business. I had also some questions about can we measure political risk today? How can we measure it? Are there new methods of measurement of political risk given the changing geopolitical context? And can we learn about the past from the past? For example, from World War I, World War II, other crises. So I'm not sure I've taken all the questions, but there are many questions in the chat. Of course, there is the issue of can companies afford to finance, for example, some advices on political risk, or recruit some people to doing that, maybe with some international relations background? Is it useful? So I'm not sure I have taken all the questions, but there are already many. And I know that Vanessa also had a question to add before we made a new round of our three speakers.
Yeah, thank you. But actually, they were quite related with the question that came in the chat. I mean, I had a question related to the cost of insuring companies, indeed, because yes, you can insure yourself against the risk, but then will that mean that in a world that becomes more and more uncertain, only the biggest firm or very specific sectors like natural resources will be able to invest abroad? So do you see a world where that we go back maybe like 50 years ago, where there are much less worldwide investments because of political risk? and other risk. And another question that is very much related to the question in the chat and has to do with the methodology. In the past, many companies will look as well at the notation from notation agency, the country risk level, which is not just political risk, but also economical risk. So it was both together, and I will give you an idea of whether it is dangerous to actually invest in some countries. But as Hannes said, and the three of you, political risk is becoming very specific at the firm level. So do we still need notation agencies?
Maybe we can start with on the same order, Cecilia first.
Yeah,
Julian,
absolutely.
Hannes. Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm overwhelmed with these questions, which are absolutely interesting and relevant. So I would just go through some of them and say something, about them, and then pass the floor. So first of all, I just want to leave this out for reflection. Like one of the questions was, how can businesses afford this? My question is, can they afford not to? Can they afford not to have some level of political awareness today? I would say it depends very much on the international exposure or political exposure of the firm. But I would say that my sense is that also based on the research, the interviews I've been doing these past few years, is that there's a new awareness and there's a new willingness of companies in general to invest more in this kind of sort of endeavor, political risk analysis. And what about? And I have another question that struck me my sort of imagination in a sense. Would it be crazy to imagine that military intelligence could be shared with national companies to benefit the national economy? Well, this is already happening. Like, it depends, of course, again, on the company. I don't think that you can have a government share classified information with everyone, but I can totally imagine, like, sometimes we talk about very big companies which are already somehow, they see the participation of the government in their boards. And then thinking about, for instance, the Italian energy giant Eni, right? So you do have a diplomat, like a career diplomat, sitting on the board of the company. So this means that it doesn't, I'm not saying that there's this direct sharing of military intelligence with the company, but it is obvious that when we talk about these big businesses, there is a geopolitical strategic interest of the government in sort of supporting the activity of the firm. So another thing that I wanted to respond to is this question about how do we know, like, how do we get rid of the Western bias? This is a very good question. I think we do need a mentality shift. The political risk analysis industry, as we studied it, we say it beforehand, it is a very Western endeavor. But now, I mean, we don't live in the immediate post-World War II world where, most of investment was flowing from the US, into Europe. And that's where we are living a very different world. So we do need to become aware of the bias, but also, it's difficult. For instance, just to tell you about my experience, I was interviewing a US company doing consultancy work, political risk, consultancy work. And they were telling me, for instance, they can do research on China and have Chinese sources, but they cannot work for China's companies, for instance, right? Because they, especially if they also cooperate with the Department of State, they have, they're very, very, they have red lines they cannot cross in a sense. So this is a very important problem we need to be aware of. And another thing I wanted to say, because I saw a question on experts, and let me see if I can find the question again. Like, how do you see the integration of data analysts with backgrounds in political science or AR in corporate? That's absolutely key. I mean, there's a very interesting study by Philip Tetlock, who is a prominent US political psychologist, let's call it this way. And he's into super forecasting. So he studies how human beings are able to forecast the political reality. And what he found is that over many years of studies that in fact it's better, like people, like it's not about how much you study that topic, is about how you think. And he also finds that the people who make the best political forecasters are people with a very, very diverse background. So I would certainly think that data analysts with background in political science are excellent candidates if they have that mental sort of flexibility to incorporate very different sort of pieces of knowledge and a very versatile style of thinking, like, you know, framework. I think these would certainly make an excellent analyst, probably, according to what we know. Just one last point, because I saw my name on. No, so there's a question by Ling. Thank you very much for your questions. They're all super relevant. So you're saying this interplay is new? No, I don't think there's. I mean, I'm not sure there is. I mean, there is anything really new. In the sense that we can learn from the past. The question is the pace of change. Perhaps the only thing that is really new is the pace of change, and how we sort of we lack sometimes the tools to understand what's going on. So in the sense that back in the day, there was like a sense of, okay, I can understand even like where the technological progress is going, and where it is and what we can do with that, where versus today we are at the point, especially with the artificial intelligence and everything else, where it may be even difficult to understand to what extent these may be a game changer. I don't know. I hope I answered the question, but let's have more answers and perhaps more questions.
Thank you, Cecilia. Julian?
Yeah, thanks. Oh, wonderful questions. Some very difficult, but we'll try our best. I'll start with following up on this point that Cecilia is making to that very important question, in terms of, you know, the sort of what the future holds and how difficult that will be, given the rapid technological changes. It's also relevant to the question, the second one in the chat there, about traditional tools for measuring political risk. You know, are they outdated, and do we need new methods to be invented? I mean, it's like yes and no. I think we're to the point where, you know, 2 years ago we didn't have the AI large learning models available to all, and then, you know, a year later we had it available to all, and now it can do everything for you. And I don't think we know the extent to which the rapid change will cause this sort of this political risk industry and, you know, experts and measuring risk to, like, we don't know the extent to which this will all change. Like, we don't know it because it's such a rapidly changing environment with AI, right? So imagine that you could, if you're an expert, or you're someone who's looking for an expert, and you can just type this in, the answer you get today from ChatGPT or Microsoft or whatever is not great. It'll be very broad. It'll be very, you know, high level, whatever the model has, you know, scoured the internet for over the past, you know, year or two. And so you might get a high level sense of what's going on with that issue or that industry or that country. It will likely be outdated. And so to Hannes's point, you know, the historical and the tried and true methods and tools that we have are still important to use. And, like, you know, you're going to need some good human intelligence. You're going to need the data that you've trusted, and the sources, like the producers of that data who you know, rather than just rely on AI. However, to my point, we don't know the extent to which that will rapidly change, to the point where maybe AI will be just as reliable, if not completely reliable in an instant, say a year or two from now, because it's so exponential, the growth in the technological changes. And I think that also comes back to this first question in the chat, around, you know, US, China, the lack of reliable information. I mean, this is all in the same broader picture, right? And we already all know that we have massive challenges with disinformation and misinformation and reliability of information and biases and who we get that information from. And so again, this is all part and parcel of sort of the same broader topic. And I think it is very difficult to manage the you know, this greater context of misinformation and reliable information. Often, you know, especially with political views, you're in the sort of echo chamber of that same information that flows back to you. Again, with AI and the algorithms, it's going to feed that information even more and more to you. That's more on the political side, but you know, how can analysts produce accurate and valid assessments when those sources are limited or unbalanced? And I'll go further and say not only are they limited and imbalanced, but also, you know, potentially misinformed or disinformed purposefully. You know, those can be used as, you know, weapons, right? Information that way. And so again, back to Hannes's point, you know, to have in this case, the first example that the question in the chat of having, you know, well-informed, trusted advisors or trusted, you know, human sources of intelligence who can sift through that information, you know, on the ground experts. I think that's key that will remain important, to be able to have those, you know, human tools to sift through what this, you know, sort of what we're bombarded with in terms of information. I think that's also related to a question further down, as well, although now I can't exactly remember which one it was. Obtaining data, paying experts, right? Having a risk assessment in-house unit is expensive. You are correct. Not all companies can afford it. You are correct. How can you estimate when it's worth it? I think Cecilia did a good job answering that. You know, maybe you have to consider, can we afford not at least considering it? Again, the size of the company, to come back to Vanessa's question, is very important here. You know, larger MNCs with huge footprints and, you know, almost endless budgets. You know, we have these massive corporations that have revenues that are greater than many governments, right? And so we're talking about massive resources. Now, those can of course afford in-house. They can of course afford, you know, Deloitte and Ernst & Young and all the best consultants who are going to charge whatever they want, right? The smaller companies perhaps not. And so they're going to be required to make, you know, tough decisions on, you know, do they have those resources available to be able to sort of manage. I think that it really depends in terms of, is it worth it? It depends on your exposure to risk and the industry that you're working in. And of course, you know, the potential country that you're investing. I think those are three key things to consider, whether or not am I actually exposed to some political risk, which now has also, I think, in my view, should be more and more consideration also for domestic sort of investments, not just foreign investments. To Vanessa's question, if I remember, you know, correctly, again on this topic of, you know, are we going to go back to, is it just going to be large companies who are going to be involved in free trade? I mean, this is such a good question, and I think it's more. I think the way in which the answer will come to be revealed is on more along the lines of like, are we really witnessing a restructuring of the global economy? Like, it's hard to predict right now if this, you know, populism / you know, onshoring, reshoring, like, is this really going to end or push aside neoliberal globalization as we've known it for 30 years for good? I don't think you can easily answer that. I'm not sure. But if this is the trend and this is the case that, okay, you know, even though it's cheaper and more efficient for me to import and export and, you know, focus on economies of scale and this and that, given the, you know, the issues with tariffs and trade wars and political instability, and, you know, hot and cold geopolitical issues, is it just makes more sense for me to onshore these critical industries and have, you know, say an electric vehicle industry that can go from extraction all the way to batteries and everything in between, whereas, you know, for so long we've relied on, you know, just in time and you know, trade and exports, etc., from different countries to complete that supply chain, right? So I think that's just as important, if not more. important of a question, then, can you, the company, is it large enough to afford insurance? Is it large enough to afford, protection and coverage? And those questions are, again, are very valid. I think that's why you're starting to see governments push forward with more support on export financing, and business development, because they know that, many small firms cannot afford some of the larger, like, political risk coverage. But even political risk insurance, it's limited to what you pay, right? So if you're only covering a certain amount of perils like expropriation or political violence and terrorism, all these other things may not be covered. And then, like any insurance policy, they're only going to pay you what your policy includes, right? So, big issues to consider. I'll try and respond to the direct question addressed to myself. Given the recent developments in the US, which is not an emerging market, agreed, and China, debatable. Yes, I agree. I think there's a lot of discourse out there, not just the past year, but even the past 5 years, to make the argument that, okay, maybe China should no longer be considered an emerging market like it once was in, the 90s and 2000s, because it is very mature now, huge domestic, but still there's that giant manufacturing base and export reliance. So that's the kind of, definitional stuff. And so, risk have mainly focused on frontier markets. This is probably shifting rather quickly. I would say yes, over the past few years, especially as we've witnessed, the populist resurgence, doubling down on some of that, Brexit, Trump, all that type of stuff, far right governments all across Europe. I do agree that has shifted in the sort of political science view as well. Yeah, there's a lot of really insightful questions here. I guess we'll come back in the second round. So I'll leave Hannes some.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for the questions. A lot of questions. I'll try to answer them quickly. First of all, the question, how do you get access to human intelligence data? That's, of course, most difficult. I would say, to understand that, how that works, you have three different levels of information. And that the first level is open source information, which is available, books, publications, and any information from the internet. Then you have a second level when you deal with and when you have access to well-informed people in the country, journalists, scientists, academics, politicians. And then you have the third level when we're really talking about intelligence, so deepest insights, secret service information, and that's the most crucial level. It's also the most expensive level, of course, because information that goes along with high costs also for enterprises. That's information you need to have access to. It's kind of raw data you have to buy and then use that for your consulting strategies. How to get access to that? I would say I personally have an academic past, and I did my studies in the post-Soviet space, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, also Ukraine, and by doing that you get to know a lot of interesting people, and some of them, academics, turned out they have access to any information you need in that regard. So in the post-Soviet space and also in Southeastern Europe, I have first direct access to that information, but at the very same time, there are lots of business consultants, business consulting companies like ours who have access to that information in other areas of the world, Latin America, Southeast Asia, China, India. So if you get in touch with the right consulting companies, they can help you out with human intelligence information around the world. So we have business partners we always rely on when we work with Africa. So in this case, we buy the information from them, vice versa. So that's how it works. But human intelligence information, and now coming to another question, is very, very important, because somebody asked about how to get access to balanced sources, and balanced sources and an objective, most objective, I don't know, it's not possible. Most objective view is very important. So when you work on China, you have to get access to human intelligence information in China. When you work on Russia, you have to get access on that on Russia. Otherwise, when you look through the glasses from our culture, our countries, and our experiences and expectations, that will always be biased in the end. There's another question of how to separate geopolitical risk from narrative noise. So that's the same issue, same method. I'm in this regard, I do not trust so much in software-based analytical tools. In the end, it's always about human intelligence sources and well-informed sources from countries and people from the other side, and then you have to look at that through different glasses, take different perspectives. China versus USA, a very difficult question. What is the more difficult environment today? I mean, we were all wondering about USA because it's an emerged market, industrialized country, and with a well-functioning institutional setting, laws, regulations, all clear according to the standards of an OECD country. But now what we now see and what is all surprising us is personalized politics and how a person, a charismatic leader, is doing politics according to his own wishes, and that distorts the institutional setting to a certain degree. But basically, I would say it's still a very stable market. Well, China it's always difficult, you know. Always very difficult to make broad general conclusions. In the end, you always have to take the micro perspective. But I would say the less the legal system is developed, the less the separation of powers works, the more risky a country is. So China has made huge progress in this regard. But also, I'm not a China expert, so I'm an expert on the post-Soviet countries. Well, how to link political risk to business performance? Always difficult to really to measure performance, because you have to measure performance and then single out the fact of political risk. And sometimes you can measure damages, political risk damages, what damages caused by political risk, and then you can really measure the impact. I would say, business, the link between political risk and business strategies. Basically, you always have to, you need an individual approach. You need a workshop where you understand the business context, the business operation, where you really zoom into that. Then you make a scenario analysis of how political risk factors impact on those different areas you look into and the specific firm level or project case. Then you do the assessment and then you develop strategies and hopefully in the end the strategies help the company to have better performance or be more successful in the countries. Is it worth it? Here, I would say definitely yes. If you have a loss because you do not go into the country, it's a big loss of a project opportunity. If you just imagine if you do business with the wrong people in an emerging country, you get expropriated, and that could be a damage of billion of US dollars or euro, and on the other hand, getting some advice on that would have cost 80,000 euro, maybe, including human intelligence information, maybe a bit more than. I mean, that's a big difference. And in the end, I would always say it's definitely worth it, and the price is not very high. Africa, how to analyze Africa. Well, I can only say that from my perspective, some years ago, I've published another book, State Capture, Political Risk and International Business, also by Routledge. I would highly recommend you look into that, because the state capture model, in my opinion, is a very good model to conceptualize, analyze political risk in African countries as well. I'm I lack the human intelligence insights in Africa. The empirical cases in that book are from Black Sea region countries, but definitely here I can highly recommend you to look in the book as well. Yes, that's what I can say. The questions I can answer. I cannot answer all the questions, but thanks a lot also for your questions, and maybe we have another round of questions. I do not know. There's still enough time.
We can see, I see that one of the last question is to show the book again. So I show it. It's Routledge, published by Routledge, Handbook of Political Risk by Cecilia Sottilotta, Julian Campisi, Johannes Leitner, and Hannes Meissner. Johannes and Hannes are both partners in a consulting firm, which is, what is the name, Hannes, of your consulting firm?
L&M Political Risk and Strategy Advisory GmbH.
Yes. What I would say also is that, of course, what you have shown is the fact that politics and business is more and more intertwined. It's an important effect, but also causes of the development of this political risk. Political conflicts create new geopolitical risk, of course, political evolutions, global trends. But of course, your business has to cooperate with state actors, and as Cecilia was saying, there are more and more people, for example, diplomats going to boards in companies or becoming public affairs directors, and that's exactly why we have decided to create in ESCP since 3 years a specialized master of international business and diplomacy. And one of the outcome, of course, of this master is to allow the people working for managing political risk, working in public affairs, working on economic intelligence, these kind of things, which are very important in order to manage political risk. So this is, of course, an argument for a better relation between business actors and state actors, between political science and business studies, between the micro level, very operational, with a macro level, which is probably more related to the evolution of international relations. But these are new avenues for us, for our works, and especially for the ESCP Geopolitics Institutes. I don't think that we have many questions left, because we are already coming to the end of this webinar. Yes, one question, and maybe this is a good question to make another round. It's a question of someone who asks if something changed in your thinking after you have written the book, contributed to the book. Do you have, after this episode of writing, personally, I've learned a lot because I've written a contribution on European strategic autonomy, which is, of course, a public intervention, a public European policy dealing with management of political risk at a macro level, of course, but it can help firms. But I ask you, the three of you, has something changed in your mind after you have written this book and contributed to this book? Cecilia first.
Okay, so first of all, it was a lot of work. So that was the first thing. No, that's a very interesting question. What surprised me, not surprised me, but sort of I raised the sort of increase my I don't know, my perception of political risk, in a sense, as a relevant topic, is that people with very, very different backgrounds immediately understood what we were talking about. So we do have, in the book, we have contributors who are political risk people, so you don't need to explain to them what this is. They already know, they've already been working on this, etc. But sometimes we also got on board people who are not necessarily political risk expert. Maybe they're expert on climate change. Maybe they're expert on other areas, or area people, right? And they kind of almost immediately understood what we were talking about. So this means that there is an awareness of political risk as something that's directly relevant to the activity of businesses today. So that would be, and maybe the other thing, just connected to what Anna said before, is I do think that, and maybe I acquired this awareness in the process of co-editing this book, is the importance of trust, even in terms of knowledge. So artificial intelligence. I think there was also a question in the Q&A section before in this. I don't think that we will be replaced. That as Hannes was saying, human intelligence will be even more key, perhaps, in this age of artificial intelligence, because we need to check. Like, I was at the International Studies Association conference with Hannes, Julian, and Johannes, and one panel was about, again, artificial intelligence in geopolitical analysis. And one panelist said, if you ask a certain question to DeepSeek, think about asking about Tiananmen to DeepSeek, to ChatGPT, to Gemini, and to another, artificial big, general artificial intelligence model, they will give you completely different answers. Who tells you what's the truth, right? You need people, you need experts you really trust and who really know the context and can really sort of provide you with the sensitive insight that you need. So I don't know. I think maybe the importance of trust in the political risk analysis, sort of as an industry, as a practice.
Thank you, Cecilia. Julian.
Yeah, it's a nice sort of concluding question. One thing that's changed, I mean, like Cecilia and Hannes, this is something that I've been studying and working on, political risk for really like 10 years. And so it's hard to pinpoint exactly when, sometimes your views and your thoughts, they evolve over more time, not just like in a few, after one event, but because, like Cecilia mentioned, editing the book, it was quite a lot of work. It did take obviously more than a year. I learned a ton from all the chapters that we had to review, which were, in 25, 30 chapters that we had to review. And just so, one thing that changed was for sure one of two things, the appreciation for sort of different approaches and methods that different authors used, whether those were more quantitative or, more qualitative, or just being a practitioner and sort of explaining their case from that business perspective, from the company that they were writing about in that particular chapter. That sort of opened up my mind to, being a little more appreciative of all the different ways of assessing risk. So I think that's one thing. And two, at more macro level, maybe this is not just because of the book, but at least in the past couple of years, and especially because, learning a lot of these experts who helped write the different chapters, that assumptions can change and should change. And our assumptions and the assumptions that, the political risk or international business community has had, like I sort of alluded to before, for decades, those assumptions really need to change. Whether that's just we've seen, that Western perspective of, it's not just outward investment from the global north to the global south or to emerging economies, that's changed, right? That, the US or many parts of Western Europe are inherently more unstable now than they were, politically, economically, et cetera, however many years ago. It ebbs and flows, but I think that's an assumption that we need to revise, right? That the global economy will always be, free trade, neoliberal financialization, etc. Not so much the case that we can guarantee that this will be, in 5 or 10 years from now. I don't know what the future holds, but being open to changing your assumptions on how the world works, how the economy moves, I think is important. And that's what I've for sure learned to better appreciate. Thanks.
Well, let me answer the question from another perspective. Always when you finish a project, you ask yourself, would I do it again? And would I work with the same people again? And in this regard, I can only say yes, and I even want to have more. I'd like to use that chance right now because we're establishing the Political Risk Studies Association. Because what we have learned is that we have that this book and the authors that have contributed to our book, it's a great network. It's a network of human capital. Actually, Maxime, I don't know. I think we haven't mentioned that you have also contributed a chapter to that book. And our idea is to keep that network together and to meet on and exchange our views, our expertise on an annual and regular basis. So that's what I've learned from that. When you've reached something, established a network, keep it together and let it grow.
Thank you very much, Hannes. I think we have come to an end of our discussion, very interesting discussion. I can show again the book, the Handbook of Political Risk, which is really very useful in this changing geopolitical environment. And as a conclusion, I would say, and I will keep especially from our discussion, the fact that political risk is about human intelligence, it's about networking, it's about discussion between people. And even in a time of a growing artificial intelligence, we need more than ever human intelligence in order to cope with political risk. And that's what we are going to continue to do with the ESCP Geopolitics Institute. Thank you very much for all the people who have attended this webinar, and you will be able to view it again in a replay form on our website. Thank you very much. Thank you to our speakers, and we hope to continue to work together on this very interesting topic. Thank you, of course, to Aurélie, who helped us a lot to prepare this webinar.
Thanks to all.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.